So hello everyone and thank you for joining us. My name is Caroline Wilkinson. I'm a Business Development Manager at Empower Business Solutions powered by E.ON, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. We hope you'll enjoy listening to our range of experts bring today's topics to life. We're especially delighted to welcome two external key speakers. We've got Ellen Smith-Gillespie from the Carbon Trust, and we've also got Lucy Picket from Roche. We've got a lot to get through over the next 60 minutes, including allowing some time at the end for any questions that you may have. So let's make a start. So the agenda for today's webinar, the content that we will be covering features understanding Scope 3. So Alan will be explaining what Scope 3 is, how it's calculated, and why collaboration is fundamental. The business challenge, Dan Owen will explore the benefits of Scope 3 and how best to approach it. And putting Scope 3 management into practice, Lucy Picket will share their drive to embrace Scope 3 in their experience of partnering with us with their own supply chain. To finish off, we will have a Q&A session to answer any questions that you may have. And if you do have questions throughout the webinar, please type it in the ask a question option on your screen. And apologies in advance if we don't get round to answering every question, but we will follow up with an email afterwards. So quick introduction then. Joining us today, we have Alan Smith-Gillespie from the Carbon Trust. Alan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Caroline. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I am a director at the Carbon Trust, where I've been working for a number of years, and I lead our energy and utilities practice. And in particular, I specialize and work with companies on their carbon and sustainability strategy, as well as value chain, carbon reductions, and innovation. Good to meet you all.
Perfect, thank you. We have Dan Owen from Empower Business Solutions, powered by E.ON.
Thanks, Caroline. And first of all, I'd like to apologise to everyone today. My internet provider, unfortunately, has chosen today to improve the network in my area, which means I am tethered by hotspot. So if I do drop out any time and I'm not on camera, I apologise for that. I will have to dial straight back in. But yeah, Dan Owen, I currently head up our large sales team. However, I've been in the industry for over 25 years. I've had positions in all parts of the energy spectrum. So I've got quite a good holistic understanding of the business and how it impacts our customers as well.
Perfect, thanks Dan. And Lucy Picket from Roche.
Thanks, Caroline. So Lucy, I'm from the Roche Global Procurement Team as a Senior Sustainability Manager. My role focuses on all aspects of sustainability, working with our supply chain, and most recently leading up the Global Scope 3 approach. So really great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks, Lucy. So let's get started. So I'll hand over to Alan, who will now talk about understanding Scope 3 and the fundamentals.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Before diving in, I would like to give a brief overview of the Carbon Trust for those of you who may not know us. Our mission is to accelerate the move to a decarbonised future, and we've been working with businesses in the UK and around the world for over 20 years now, from setting strategy to deploying solutions, measuring impacts, and providing assurance of the outputs of this impact. And we've really seen a tremendous development over the last several years on improving the understanding of Scope 3 emissions and what to do about them and how to deliver the impacts as well. So it's a real pleasure to be here to talk about the topic. What I'd like to start by doing is to give a quick overview as to what are Scope 3 emissions. I will then look at how these can be measured, how targets can be set around them, and some best practice around managing those as well. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is a guidance and a standard document which companies use to account for carbon emissions from their organizations. And these are organized in 3 scopes of emissions: Scope 1 and 2, which is your own organizational emissions within the walls of your company as such, and Scope 3 emissions, which is everything outside of a company's organizational footprint. That includes upstream Scope 3 emissions and downstream emissions. The upstream emissions are from those primarily around what a company procures, the downstream emissions around the activities downstream of where a company is, how products are used, how they're ultimately disposed of downstream. There are 15 categories of emissions, and the extent to which these different categories vary in terms of the importance in the Scope 3 emissions depends very much around the industry that companies find in. You will see some of the main ones I mentioned. Purchased goods and services is typically a very high impact one for manufacturing companies. Logistics upstream is very important as well. For service companies, commuting and business travel will be very important. And of course, for those companies that produce energy consuming products, the downstream impacts of those are potentially very large. To illustrate how the patterns of these can vary quite substantially by industry, on the next slide, we see how the distribution can very much change based on whether a company is, for example, in dairy or in manufacturing, through to the manufacturing at the bottom, for example, of home appliances. So at the top, you'll see companies that have, or sectors that have emissions very much driven upstream of their companies. So the light blue is a company's own Scope 1 and 2. The dark blue to the left of that is the Scope 3 upstream. The yellow is the Scope 3 downstream. So agricultural supply chains very much in the upstream, heavy manufacturing as well. And then for those where you have energy consuming products, the downstream impacts are very substantial. So it's really important to get a sense of how Scope 3 actually can be drastically different between what kind of company, what kind of industry you're in. On the next slide, we'll see how, again, depending on the sector, and apologies perhaps for the rather small font, but the ratio effectively of, this is just looking at the upstream supply chain emissions compared to a company's Scope 1 and 2, again, can vary drastically depending on the industry. So you'll see at the very top, we have retail, apparel. These are industries where the supply chain emissions are really big. So up to over 20 times that of a company's Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Whereas in some other sectors, is actually more the downstream, which doesn't appear in this graph. So it's important to understand what is driving carbon emissions. That's what we'll go on to look at next. Just a bit more context before looking at measurement. The organization globally that sets the standards around carbon target setting is called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And one of the reasons why it's really important that we're here talking about Scope 3 is, as you can see, the Scope 3 emissions are typically the biggest impact that a company has. But importantly, the Science-Based Targets Initiative requires companies to commit to Scope 3 reductions, especially when they form a higher percentage of their total Scope 1 and 3. So typically, if a company's emissions are above a certain threshold, they have to also set a Scope 3 emissions target. And in terms of what those Scope 3 emission targets look like, on the right-hand side, you'll see these two dots underneath the value chain of Scope 3. The graph shows that the two trajectories that companies have available to them in order to set targets and decarbonize. The SBTI, their latest standards require companies to set a target between 5 to 10 years from their baseline, from a starting year. And if you say take a 10-year for simplistic purposes, let's say taking to 2030, a company effectively would need to decarbonize at least by 25% their Scope 3 emissions, or up to 42% over 10 years for the more ambitious pathway. So the challenge is really set for companies about how substantially they need to decarbonize their Scope 3, and that is not an easy matter on even a short-term or near-term target basis, as we can see here. Now, on the next slide, we'll see that the SBTI has also just published their standard for net zero, and many of you will have heard the term net zero. Net zero, as opposed to the near-term targets or 5 to 10-year targets, which we just saw, are targets that companies have the option to also commit to. Of course, all of this is optional, but this sets really the leading standard. So the optional commitment to achieve net zero by 2050 at the latest, and that requires for Scope 3 emissions a 90% decarbonization from the starting year. So any company that's planning to commit to net zero has to include Scope 3 within that commitment if it exceeds a certain percentage. If it's above 40% of total Scope 1, 2, and 3, you have to set a Scope 3 target. And if you want to say you're going to be a net zero company or you're committing to that, you need to commit to decarbonizing Scope 3 by 90%. It's important to reiterate that because that really sets the scale of the challenge that we have. Going on to the next slide, this is to summarize the typical challenges companies have on measuring, setting, and implementing Scope 3. So starting on the measurement side, many times companies have limited access to data around their Scope 3 emissions. Typically, a company will have a good grip as to what drives carbon within their organization, but much less around what is emitting carbon either upstream or downstream, how much, who's doing it, what are the key categories it's coming from. And there are also, on top of that, many different calculation methods that you can use, and we'll look at that in a moment. Target setting, of course, in the context of data uncertainty becomes more challenging because the certainty to which you can achieve that target might be compromised if you have very bad data. You're unsure about what effectively your baseline year is and how you're going to measure progress against it. And that, of course, then has knock-on effects around your implementation ability and ability to report. And we'll touch upon some of these aspects, majoring especially around the measurement in the next few slides. So when it comes to methodology development for measurement, that first step, there are a number of ways of doing it. A reasonably simple way, but with a high degree of error, is what you can see on the right-hand side, which is what's called using EEIO factors, or environmentally extended input-output factors. That effectively translates spend data into carbon emissions. So a company will understand what they have spent and on what categories, and that spend can be converted into carbon using some specific emission factors. This allows companies to develop a Scope 3 relatively rapidly. However, it has a high degree of uncertainty, as I've mentioned. The ideal is for from the supply chain for upstream Scope 3 emissions to have life cycle carbon footprints for the products that a company buys. And I think we can acknowledge that that level of data is often not available. It is increasingly becoming available, but it is something that ultimately, if a company wants to improve their Scope 3 upstream supply chain information, they need to know that. And overall, even for downstream, to move from high-level estimates towards more activity-based data, where carbon emissions can be attributed to a specific quantity of product purchase, for example, or an activity of a product in use downstream, for instance. So that goes on to the next slide, which shows an illustrative journey of improving data accuracy and quality over time. You will, in the first time you have a crack at doing this, start off with a very high-level estimate with a wide range of uncertainty, and the idea is to gradually narrow that towards higher certainty around the quantification of Scope 3 emissions. It is important to take a prioritized view on this. It is not essential to have the most accurate Scope 3 data for all your categories, for every single thing that you procure, or for necessarily all the products that you manufacture. And you need to understand what are the ones that are likely to be the biggest drivers, and that is where you want to initially focus this data improvement perspective. It requires, the more accurate the data, the higher the cost, the higher the effort. So it does require some prioritization of where to focus that effort. Going on to the next slide. This provides a perspective as to how this data could be used for setting targets, but also for tracking performance and planning the implementation. So the baseline of Scope 3 emissions will be the first step that a company needs to take. Where are they today? That allows you to then assess, and what's an important step is to assess where that baseline might evolve. How could it evolve over the coming years? This takes the broad view from the science-based target of setting an interim near-term target, say by 2030, and then the 2050 target. So just taking those 2 points in the future, you'll see from this graph that you will want to view how does your scope 3 evolve, what are the scenarios that might make it grow by a higher or lower degree to your 2030 target, and of course that will continue to 2050. But that gives you a sense of the scale of ultimately decarbonization, which is the green bars that you need to get to. So it's not just a decarbonization strictly from your baseline, but ultimately where you could be under a business as usual no action scenario. So that means you need to make growth as low reduce the carbon intensity of growth as much as possible over the next 10 years for the first near-term target. So the point that we looked at earlier on around the accuracy of scope 3 data is going to be important to then focus that on those categories that are likely to drive potential growth in the future, and also in terms of assessing what are the best reduction measures that you could take in order to meet near-term or longer-term targets. So a scope 3 footprint of the right level of accuracy and granularity informs A, how it might evolve into the future, and B, where to focus your action, which is the green bars here. And that's we'll briefly touch on some of these things in the following slides. This, at a very high level, summarizes the key levers that we see companies taking and needing to take to decarbonize scope 3 emissions. At the center of the donut there that you see at the left, there are two sides of the same coin, really, which are big levers for scope 3 decarbonization. One is acting directly on your supply chain. The other is looking at the products and services that you sell. And there are a number of levers that you can take to address both sides. Some will generate efficiency improvements, which at scale have a substantial impact. Others will be more transformational and probably fewer, but as single areas of action will have a much bigger impact. And the idea is to build a portfolio of these levers, which will evolve over time. Again, going back to the previous points, having good scope 3 data means you know which areas of action to focus on and to prioritize, and then you keep on learning from that over time. You also try to improve your data so that you can measure progress against any of these actions that you might take. So they range from looking at supplier engagement actions, developing programs to get your supply chain, again, prioritized by those that are the key drivers of carbon, to reduce emissions, for example, by driving energy efficiency with specific suppliers, getting them to adopt renewable energy, getting them to think about how they design the products to make them less carbon intensive products. So those are things that a company can do with their supply chain externally. And also internally, there's a number of actions that a company can also take that where they have more direct influence, such as your own product design, making sure that your products are as less carbon intensive as possible with the materials that you use, making them more circular, for example, using high recycled content. And if they're an energy consuming product, of course, that they are best in class downstream. And also taking custody, in a sense, or stewardship of that product throughout its life cycle towards the end. I'd like to complete this picture by illustrating a little bit more specifically about how data can help you take a prioritized or segmented approach in engaging your suppliers. We've just seen that supplier engagement is really an important area that companies need to undertake. And depending on the impact that any given supplier or category of product has, and the nature of the relationship, the strategic value of the relationship that you will have with your suppliers, you can undertake a number of different types of supplier engagement processes. One is very dedicated one-to-one initiatives, some more one-to-many, some are more intensive and resource intense, depending on the amount of the initiatives you're undertaking with them. Others are a lot lighter touch. your Scope 3 data, the quality of that data, to understand what is driving carbon in your supply chain, in your value chain, will be very important to help you take the right prioritized and segmented approach to supplier engagement. So I'd like to finish off with a few summary points. And that is going back to the fact that there is increasing demands on companies to report their Scope 3 emissions. We talked about the Science Based Targets Initiative. Some of you may be reporting to or be asked to report to the CDP, which is a global reporting platform for carbon. And also the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, or TCFD, for those companies that fall under that, also require improvement in terms of the metrics, carbon metrics that they report. So there's going to be increasing requirement of you as companies to report the best quality Scope 3 data possible. And what I hope that these last few slides have clarified is that the quality at which you want to do it will will improve over time. You need to take a prioritized view as to where you want to focus your data gathering and your quality improvement efforts. And that will be very important to help you understand which targets you should commit to understand where the reductions should come from, and thirdly, which suppliers and which other partners in your ecosystem you should be engaging with in order to deliver those reductions. So with that, I'm happy to hand over to the next speaker.
That was great. Thanks, Alan. And really interesting, I think, looking at different industry types and understanding where Scope 3 sits quite highly compared to others, as well as understanding in detail how segmenting your approach when it comes to suppliers is kind of key for identifying those reduction opportunities. So that was fantastic. Thank you. Next, we have Dan Owen, who will talk about how best to approach Scope 3.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Right, okay, so there's going to be some crossover here, but I think that's really important. So we start to tie together what we've just heard and indeed what you then need to do. So if we go on to the first slide, we can see how to approach Scope 3 and stay sane. So first thing to remember, you are not alone, okay? This is compliance. As Scope 3 can typically account for such a high percentage of emissions, it can also require the biggest consideration on the carbon net zero journey. There's no escaping it, and both your business partners and competitors will need to be on the same road. So having a clear plan strengthens your supply chain, and by proxy yourself. Those who don't plan will be disrupted at a later stage. You know, that's our firm belief. And as we heard earlier, there are 15 distinct Scope 3 categories, ranging from business travel to leased assets, all relating to the indirect emissions which come from your business's value chain. And depending on what your business does, some will deliver more valuable and measurable results than others. So next on here, circular economy. Circular economy is key. We hear it as a strapline quite a lot, but this is in action. So look to your existing supply chain partners. The answer is going to be all around you. It's the customers and businesses that you work with every day. So come together to face this challenge, and adding value, it will pay off. Next on here cannot be underestimated. Find a trusted energy partner. Ensure that you have a contact, an account manager who you trust and who deliver the insight that you need. At times you'll need to be challenged. So make sure you've got good relationships and there's people telling you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. And in addition, make sure that they've got access, which means you've got access to products, solutions, and reporting capability, which will meet the requirement of your whole chain, and just ensure they're a partner that can be there for the long term. As you'll no doubt have seen in the press at the moment, this is a pretty tough time in the industry. You need to make sure you're choosing partners that are definitely going to be here for you for the 5-10 year journey that you'll be on. Next, believe in your plan. When you know what you want to do and understand both the compliance and commercial impacts, promote it internally within your supply chain. Only by believing and taking others on that journey can you succeed. You know, carbon reduction needs to become part of your business DNA. It needs to be that kind of thing that you're preaching about, you're talking about. You need to believe it. You really do for you to be a success. Next, consider the energy you purchase, but also how you and your supply chain use it. So we've just heard about this, finding a scope 3 compliant way to purchase energy, step 1, consider that step 1. But then how can you influence how that energy is used? Do you even know where it's used? To that point, how will you report the effort that you're doing? This is going to take investment in terms of time, which also means investment in terms of money. Evidencing how you have influenced and changed carbon is going to be vital. So how are you going to quantify, and what tools are available to you? For each of the 15 Scope 3 categories, begin by using high-level data to determine the contribution it makes to your overall greenhouse gas emissions. Then you can go a little deeper by using criteria such as size, influence or risk to the business to decide whether the category should be considered a relevant focus for your area for your business Scope 3 emissions reduction. Then the last one on here, look for opportunities beyond Scope 3, right? You're having to do this piece of work, okay? This is a journey you are ultimately having to go on, but there's got to be other things which can be addressed here. So when you are coming together in this supply chain way, what other things can be addressed at the same time? How can the supply chain be improved? Once again, vital to have an energy partner that you could work with, where this is never going to be, by the way, copy and paste. It's not one size fits all. As each supply chain, there are going to be different ways of looking at it, different types of consumers within your chain. But by understanding where there's been opportunities and risks in like industries, you can win off that. And why not look for opportunities with her there? Okay, next slide, please, Caroline. Thank you. So it's never been more important to ensure your supply chain is as healthy as possible. Better collaboration can protect the supply chain and benefit your business. Disrupted supply chain, and this has been on the news for everybody to see. It's been the biggest impact to economic growth in 21. You need your supply chain to be healthy. So engaging with that chain, collaborating on energy supply deals, encouraging effective monitoring of emissions, etc., sharing best practice on carbon emissions, it's going to be vital it's vital to be carbon committed leaders. And it doesn't actually matter if you are the top of the chain in terms of influence or you are within the chain. I think we all now have to be committed leaders on that carbon journey. It's up to us all to do best practice, really. So the road to net zero emissions is difficult unless businesses collaborate. That's a fact. In fact, the overarching aim of Scope 3 is not to reduce your own organisation's emissions, but to facilitate a global shift towards a low carbon economy. Every business is being called upon to take responsibility for carbon emissions that are beyond its direct control. And therefore, we've all got to work together to get to this net zero position. This means that successful progress begins with the complex task of engaging with that supply chain. And I don't think any of us are trying to minimize how difficult that will be, especially if it's not something you're used to doing, because you're going to cross across geographical and cultural boundaries. It's no mean feat, and it's going to create different challenges for each organization. Once again, I just want to, emphasize, we know it's not one size fits all. And that's why you're going to have to, and I'm going to keep coming back to this, have an energy partner, an account manager who can help you on this. So we do have some steps, and we have got, some tips for better collaboration. Now, this is a lot of information coming at you. We will share these slides and some of this information. So you don't need to be scribbling this all down. We will share this, but we've got 5 top tips for better collaboration. So number 1, set clear expectations for your suppliers. Consider incentivizing supply chain partners to improve their carbon reduction measures and their data gathering methods. Have a clear criteria for any new suppliers you enlist, as well as internal procurement targets that have environmental and ethical standards built in. Now, that incentivization, that can come in different ways. Once again, I'm going to come back to what I said on that first slide. How can a supplier help you with that? What does incentivization look like? Number 2, set up interviews with suppliers to better understand their processes and people, and to get a view on where improvements could be made, as well as their obstacles to carbon reduction. Everybody's going to have a different obstacle. People are going to be on different journeys. Some people won't have started the journey at all. Number 3, facilitate workshops with key suppliers to help them understand where action could be taken on carbon reduction. This will also provide a forum for peer-to-peer support and will help to foster innovation, encourage an exchange of best practices. And that's what this is. It's about sharing where have you seen best practice, where have you walked into risk, but where have you found opportunities? It's just sharing your experience. Number 4, provide co-branded training materials for your suppliers' teams to help them spread the word on net zero and to get everyone behind the efforts you're making to reduce carbon. Number 5, get your internal stakeholders on board right from the outset. This is that DNA piece I was talking about. The best results will be achieved by having input and oversight from right across your business, including procurement teams and the C-suite. Your net zero strategy needs to align with broader business objectives if you want to ensure that everyone is invested in driving carbon reduction. It's not something you can do with half effort. It's got to be full belief. We'll get those 5 tips shared on the slides when we get those out later. Caroline, go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so options to consider for your business. I am purposely keeping this broad. Okay, this isn't about a particular product that any one particular supplier can offer you. This is the general stuff that's out there, and make no apology for that, because that's your starting point. Okay, and this is where we should all be starting, and then you can deep dive with your supplier, with your account manager to understand, okay, but what else? So right, let's start with what I guess is broadly accepted as the easiest way to approach. And this is renewable energy guarantees of origin, Rego backed energy. Now, problem or not, I don't think problem's the right way to describe it, but Rego prices can fluctuate. So easy doesn't necessarily also mean commercially advantageous. So options to consider for your business. These are purposely broad. We're not looking at any specific product which a supplier might be able to offer here. This is about those things which are out there for everybody. There are further conversations which you can obviously have with your account manager to say, okay, but what else? What's specific? And we're going to start with Rego, renewable energy guarantees of origin. So probably broadly accepted, the easiest start point. Now, Rego is widely used, but is also at the moment quite volatile in price. So easy doesn't necessarily mean cheap, and that's definitely something to consider. Those Rego costs can fluctuate at any given time. They're also not something you can market off the back of. They are, however, compliant. So these are things that you need to weigh up in terms of where are you on your business strategy? What is it that you want to do? What I will say is there's Regos can change in type. And if I was to generalize, you've got something which could be classed as very deep green, so just a wind farm, to something like a biomass. Now, that will all come down to some of your individual requirements and needs. Rego certification is Rego certification, though, and that's how you should see it. Next on the list here, we've got corporate power purchase agreements, CPPAs. Now, in the UK, this is still a relatively, and I say relatively, new thing. You know, we're still talking the best part of a decade, but it's only recently that this is becoming more widely talked about. Now, these CPPAs, they vary in type, and I'm not going to go into a huge amount of details now because we could fill an entire webinar talking about CPPAs, but they are green sources of generation. And they can vary from a well-established CPPA where they've got a large customer book, and you may find that they don't offer the best commercial value, but they are large and they may be able to meet all of your energy needs, all the way down to something which is a new to planet. And that is somebody that's just coming online. And then if you really want to get involved in this, you can start to get into the point of commissioning. You may not own this generation point, but you have commissioned it to be there in the first place. I'm going to keep going back to this. Your energy partner is absolutely vital. That conversation, that understanding of what's best for you, reach out, have that conversation. Right, now changing a little bit, effective monitoring software. I guess in an ideal world, every business would have cutting edge data management systems and access to accurate, up-to-date information on every product and every service used. However, let's be real, this is rarely the case. And for now, I guess the message to you as businesses is to do the best you can with the data and resources you have available. But this is also where you need to consider those people that you work with. What else as a supply chain? So if you're coming together as a supply chain and having a product together, so your contractors together, how can that reporting be provided to you? Is there something which can be done to give you an advantage? Energy audits and energy solutions technology. Again, a very, very, very broad subject, and we're not going to go into all of the different types of solutions. But what would be very, very advantageous is, as you come together your supply chain, is for somebody to come in and to take a look from an energy audit or solutions aspect to say, okay, you're buying your energy, but how are you using your energy? So how can you reduce the energy you have to use, but also where can it be used in a different kind of way? That requires, a different type of thinking. And, we go back to what we heard earlier on. Buying your energy in a Scope 3 compliant way is very different than how you go on to use it. You need to consider both elements of energy. And on that, electric vehicles, EV, charging points and fleet. I think what would be an absolutely amazing thing to be able to say as a supply chain is that every journey that happens within your supply chain, you never have to worry about something like range anxiety, because you've got the infrastructure within your chain for all of the electric vehicles to be able to charge at any given point. I think that would be fantastic. But beyond that, I don't think it's possible really to ever get to your dreams of carbon net zero if you don't face into that EV question. That starts, I personally believe, with getting the infrastructure straight, and then you can start to look at your fleets. But it's something you need to be looking at. There is the obvious concern that if everybody leaves it until the last moment, you may face bottlenecks, and you may find yourself looking into increased prices as well. Caroline, could you go to the next slide, please? Right, okay, the business benefits. Okay, as the importance of measuring Scope 3 emissions grow, your organisations, you're going to be required to support the sustainability targets by looking at both the carbon impact of the areas they're responsible for and the suppliers that you use. But wherever you are, there's got to be something which gives you reason to believe beyond being told you have to, okay? And there are plenty of reasons to believe beyond being told that you have to. So if we look at the commercials, you can achieve more together. The decision to take sustainability seriously is a commercially astute one for businesses of all sizes. The Science Based Targets Initiative tells us that companies committed to the initiative are demonstrating that creating a climate secure world goes hand in hand with successful business operations. So therefore, having a robust strategy across the whole supply chain is as much about economic resilience as it is about reducing carbon emissions, as it's also going to help protect your business from future risk. So for those within the value chain of a public sector or, say, a larger corporate organisation, it will increasingly mean the difference between winning a supply tender or losing it. And I am going to pause there because I genuinely believe that, as we keep going further towards this carbon committed world, you're going to find yourself in a position that if you aren't on that journey, there'll be plenty of people that won't want to work with you anymore. That's a commercial risk, right? This is not just about being told you've got to do something. It's about protecting yourself commercially. So as well as providing an advantage over the competition, having a robust sustainability plan could also help secure investment and drive innovation, ultimately making your business more resilient for the future. And that's hand in hand with reputational. I think everybody now has heard the term greenwashing. It's become more common as consumers are now willing to call out disingenuous corporate behavior. In fact, I don't think on my Instagram feed I can go 5 or 6 posts without seeing something at the moment. It is really commonplace. And any carbon reduction strategies therefore need to be ambitious, but also based on credible data. So by including Scope 3 emissions as part of your reporting, it will demonstrate that your business is willing to go beyond Scopes 1 and 2. even if your business does not have that pressure to prioritize sustainability from within the supply chain, research has shown that potential customers are more likely to buy from a brand with strong ethical and environmental values. Therefore, it's going to be more important for that to be a differentiator. My eldest son, he's a teenager at school at the moment. He really believes in this stuff. If anybody at the moment looking to the voice of the youth, this is a loud voice right now. And that leads on to talent acquisition. We had a 2020 report. It was called Your Business Blueprint, The Road to Net Zero. Respondents fed back off the back of that one of the benefits of having a strong sustainability strategy was that they were attracting the next generation of talent. Potential new recruits are increasingly assessing a company's climate commitments as well as the more kind of traditional criteria. So including scope 3 emissions could be a key difference. It certainly would be for my son. I know that, and his friends. It's something they're actually talking about. It's a completely different world. A bit of an obvious one here, but stronger chain relations. So as the influencer, bring in solutions, commercial advantages, products and hedging benefits, and achieving the compliance targets. By proxy, you should see supply chain stability, but also increased loyalty and appreciation. That's going to pave the way to future circular economy wins. But also as someone downstream from an influencer, you're gaining those products and commercial advantages. And that proves how important you are as well, and how vital you are to building partnerships that last, but also supply chains that stay healthy. And finally, something which is very specific to your commodity, volume tolerance protection, right? Forecasted energy consumption has never been more important. If you deviate too much from your forecast, it is now highly likely that your supplier will charge you for selling back or having to buy more if the market has moved against you. But by coming together as a supply chain, there's potential that you can pull all of your volume together, which gives you a netted position. There's a lot of safety in that, a lot of protection. Those who plan effectively now is basically those who won't get caught up in that last minute dash when options could be limited due to bottlenecks or rising costs. So the one thing that I really want to leave everyone with is think about this now. It's not something to put off. It's not something to say next year or the year after. If you aren't on the journey, it really is time to start. Find that energy partner you can work with. And get planning. And that's all for me today.
Perfect. Thanks, Dan. And again, another great presentation. Just highlighting that creating that circular economy or consortium, however you want to name it, and having a solution in place, whether it is Regos or PPAs, as well as being able to measure your indirect emissions, are so important. Thanks, Dan. Now we have Lucy Picket, who will discuss Scope 3 management through partnership and action.
Thanks so much, Caroline, and thank you as well to the previous speakers. Lots of points that have resonated with me, and I'll cover off maybe in a bit more of a how do we tackle this practical way throughout my presentation. So next slide, please, Caroline. So in terms of what I'll talk about, so I'll start off by giving a bit of context around sustainability at Roche and our 125-year history. I'll then talk about Scope 3 and why now, why is this such a big challenge for us, and why have we chosen to focus on it, before moving into the action that we're taking and our partnership with E.ON. So first off, a bit of context setting, so 125 years of sustainability at Roche. So Roche is still a majority family-owned company, even though we're so large and a public organisation. And on the side there, I've got Andre Hoffmann, who is the current vice chairman of the board and the grandson of the founding family, the Fritz Hoffmann La Roche company founder. Sustainability has been truly ingrained in the organisation right from the beginning, so for 125 years. And it was actually the founding family who set up the World Wildlife Foundation, because they truly believe that the environment needs to be a consideration within business, and it's something that truly is embedded within all of our operations. So if you fast forward to today, that's still very much an ethos that remains. So that is our current chairman, Christoph Franz, and sustainability is something that is systematic within our business decisions. And having worked with the company for the last 4 years, I can absolutely, wholeheartedly say that is true. It is not something that is considered at the expense of other business criteria, but it runs alongside it. And that's something that's been recognised by our position in the Dow Jones Sustainability Index for the last 12 years running. So scope 3, why now? We have had lots of success within the areas of scope 1 and scope 2 over the past 125 years. As an example, when we started measuring greenhouse gas emissions, so between 1990 and 2020, we've reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 75%. We're on track to be net zero by, nope, sorry, I should correct that. We're on track to be absolute zero by 2050. And what we mean by that is that Roche is very proud in not using offsets and taking real action to drive real greenhouse gas emissions. This is a trickier path than most, and it takes time, but it's something that the whole organisation are committed to, and we've seen some excellent leadership from our Group SHE team who have demonstrated this over the past couple of decades. So we have some really ambitious goals within scope 1 and 2, which is to be 100% sustainable in electricity by 2025, to have emission-free vehicles for business purpose use by 2030, to phase out halogenated refrigerants, and compared to a 1990 baseline, this translates into an 85% reduction by 2025 and a 94% reduction by 2030. Next slide, please, Caroline. However, scope 1 and scope 2, as successful as we've been, it really is a tiny portion for us, unfortunately, and probably is similar to what's already been discussed today. So we started looking at our inventory for scope 3 last year, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But scope 3 for us is 95% of our environmental impacts. We have an ambition, a 10-year ambition within Roche to reduce our environmental impact by 50% by the end of the decade. And it really dawned on us that we need to be sharing the information and the action we've been taking in scope 1 and scope 2 with our suppliers, because we really have to start looking beyond our own four walls if we're going to achieve that. Next slide, please, Caroline. So this is an overview of what our scope 1, 2 and 3 footprint looks like. So as was mentioned earlier by the Carbon Trust, we have achieved this by looking at the spend data method. We're very aware it's not the best way, but it's the most accurate way that we have at the moment to understand exactly where our environmental impacts are. And it's really helped us to scope out where we need to be prioritising our efforts and which suppliers we should be working with. Next slide, please, Caroline. And we really identify the fact that we cannot do this alone. So we have really complex supply chains. We have more than 60,000 suppliers. And for some of our products, they are 9 tiers deep. We spend about 18.2 billion per year. And we really recognise that not only do we have a lot of power, I suppose, but potentially influence as well, to be able to be supporting our suppliers on their journey. But Roche is very much an organisation that does not dictate, does not set targets that are unachievable, but really wants to understand the supplier's position and to work together and collaborate to ensure that we're meeting our mutual goals. Next slide, please, Caroline. So this is how we got to our partnership with E.ON. And I think it was around 18 months ago that I approached Caroline and said we had this big challenge and we had this idea. So energy for us is a big source of emissions, and naturally that is the same for our suppliers. So what if there was a way that we could support them on their journey? And was this something that E.ON would be happy to collaborate with us on? So we came up with a proposal for a UK One Roche pilot. The first step for us in the UK was to join forces between the UK diagnostics business and the pharmaceutical business and purchase 100% Rego back to renewable energy. So that was our first step. It took some time, but we managed to get there, and it's interesting to see the amount of internal alignment that is sometimes needed to be on the same page, as is with a lot of large organisations. But it was something that was achieved. It was very proudly communicated. It was something that our employees were super interested in, and although for us that was kind of one of the stepping stones to a bigger part of the project, in itself it was something that was really very much congratulated at the highest levels. The second phase for us was to work with our supply chain to see if we could give them access to renewable energy at the same rates that we were able to secure ourselves, or at least with the same products that we were able to secure ourselves. Our thoughts here were that in response to them providing us data, we would be able to give them access to this this rate and this product. We were then able to understand a bit more about their energy usage, which would not only be used to kind of store data somewhere randomly that we never looked at again, but to understand how we might be able to support them in their broader journey. And for the longer term, which would be phase 3, to understand whether they'd be interested in and had enough requirement to join a corporate purchase power agreement. I think for us at Roche, we knew very early on that a purchase power agreement where we could obtain the energy from its source was the best way for us to go in terms of renewables. But in our own right, in the UK alone, we didn't have enough purchasing power. So we needed to aggregate that. I know that's something that Dan mentioned in his presentation as well. And we were working with E.ON to see how feasible that would be in the longer term. Next slide, please, Caroline. So this is just an output of the first phase, I suppose, and I mentioned it got a lot of attention and applause. So the UK, for the first time in 2020, were able to report 0 emissions as a result of the E.ON deal. And this was used not only internally to sell the benefit. I attended a global energy workshop within Roche and explained about what we were doing, and there was a lot of appetite to do similar in different countries as well. So it acted as a great catalyst internally for us to focus on our Scope 1 and Scope 2 footprint. Equally, we were able to share this with our suppliers. So we were able to say, you know, we're not sat here saying, this is how you need to get there and off you go. Let us know when you've done it. It was we've been through a similar journey. We're going to be very transparent with you. This is how we've done it, and we'd like to support you. And we actually have an offering here for you to have a look at as well. Next slide, please, Caroline. I think this one's going to build up. Apologies. Yeah, so a little bit about the timeline, because I think it all sounds great hypothetically, but it was quite a long journey, and it did take a lot of internal collaboration as well as bureaucracy. So we were, after many discussions backwards and forwards, on the 29th of March this year, we launched the renewable energy project to our top emission and top spend, as well as small and medium and diverse suppliers within the UK, with the E.ON and a reporting offer. We then followed up with a website which was open not only to those that we deliberately approached, but all of our supply base, so that they could go and understand a little bit more about what was on offer and register their interest. Following this, we had a big communications drive, both internally and externally, with LinkedIn posts and a media campaign to raise awareness of what we were trying to achieve and the challenges that we faced in Scope 3. And then in April, we hosted a joint webinar where those targeted suppliers were invited to attend. 55% of them took up that offer and came to understand a bit more, and all of the suppliers were sent a recording. And at this, we were very transparent about what the offer was, and the fact that Roche had kind of taken a leading position for a pharma company by actively trying to find solutions to the Scope 3 challenge that we all faced. So on World Earth Day, very fitting, Marielle Bayer, who is our Chief Procurement Officer, tweeted about the UK pilot, which again got more interest and enabled our suppliers to see that this was a genuine offer, something that was coming from the highest parts of Roche, and showing that we had kind of internal backing for wider initiatives than just ourselves. And then in April, we were able to present at the Roche Global Energy Summit to tell all of the global affiliates exactly how we had done this and to encourage similar approaches with their suppliers elsewhere. So very proud that 10% of suppliers are currently in active discussions to sign up. There have been some barriers in terms of levels of maturity of suppliers, existing contracts, but generally it was perceived as a very positive thing for us to do, particularly amongst the small and medium enterprises, as well as diverse suppliers who just wouldn't have had access or the education about why this is important without Roche facilitating this. So in terms of our next steps, so I mentioned about the 3 phases. So we're very much still in the middle of phase 2, understanding about our supply chain's challenges and a bit about their data before we start exploring on phase 3. So those are exploratory conversations we've been having now, and it's absolutely somewhere where we hope to go, to have multi-off-taker corporate purchase power agreements. And we believe that these initial phases have been really critical in those discussions. So we're not going in blindly or naively, and we've got a realistic view as to suppliers' behaviours and responses, and how this could benefit, but also the risks involved for both Roche and our supply chain. And I think that may be the end for me. Thank you, Caroline.
Thanks, Lucy. I think just to add on everything that you've gone through, we've worked quite closely for the past 18 months, and it's just been quite remarkable, I think, to see an organisation like Roche push this forward as a brand new initiative that I don't think has been done yet. So yeah, it's been a pleasure these past 18 months, and I'm looking forward to what comes next. Okay, so it's now time for our Q&A panel. So we've had quite a few questions come in already. So I'm just going to pull out a few of them and we'll run through them now. So first one we have, and I think this one would be for you, Alan, if you wouldn't mind answering it. So in reality, how time, labour intensive is calculating your Scope 3 emissions?
So thank you for the question. It does depend on the amount of data that you have, but as I mentioned earlier, and I think as Roche has done as well, there are ways that can make that easier. So the first step is to actually use the internal data that you do have, and then you can apply factors to, for example, spend data. So I think the amount of time it takes is how organized that data already is. There's actually a benefit to the effort. Many times different parts of the organization may not speak to each other, and we have done exercises working with companies where we've been looking at spend data that reveals things that the company has never realized before. So actually, it's although it might take some effort, there's a lot of value in doing it. So the key stakeholders to be working with here will be your finance team, your procurement team, and hopefully with already reasonably good data management practices, that helps things go a lot more smoothly.
That's great. Thanks, Ellen. Another one here that I think, Dan, you may be able to answer is you mentioned Rego backed energy. How plentiful is that? And surely there's only a limited supply?
Yeah, and indeed, this is what's driving some of this price fluctuation, which I referred to earlier. Rego remains, at the moment, the easiest way to approach your commodity. However, it can be influenced by large amounts of Rego certification being taken off of what we would class as a wholesale market. So if you see a large move from maybe let's make up an event, a supplier wants to make their entire residential portfolio Rego backed, all of a sudden there's a lot that have gone off the market, and then what remains, the prices go up. There is no crystal ball. There's no saying what the position will be 2 years from now, but it's absolutely correct. There is a supply and demand issue, and that will always have an influence on prices.
That's great. Thanks, Dan. Lucy, one for you, please. So how long did it take you to set up your Scope 3 project, and how much time and resource does it take? I know Alan's covered one side of this question. If you could cover the other, please.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I mean, we talked about how it's taken 18 months, and I think it was around 18 months when we started talking, Caroline, and that was kind of early concept. So I would say time-wise, it's taken that long. I think it took a lot of time to kind of analyse internally and build the business case. There was also a lot of legal involvement for us to ensure that we weren't breaching any public procurement laws, most importantly, because we supply to the NHS, and then equally from E.ON side, the anti-competitive and energy area as well. So that took some time, and we needed to get sign off at the kind of highest levels. I think as well, consideration was the number of people that needed to be involved, because Roche, well, as a global organisation, has 100,000 employees, but even within the UK, there's so many different departments that this would touch on, and it was something that was very new that was happening. So it was quite resource intensive to ensure that everyone was kept up to speed and everyone understood what we were trying to do. But what I would say is that there were key individuals that were really driving it, and I think that is really important for success, because there is a lot of complexities, there are a lot of hurdles to jump over, and I think people could easily be phased by that and decide it's not the right route. So yeah, it's something to bear in mind.
Great, thanks, Lucy. Another one for you, Alan. So what types of support do you offer businesses, and how can you help them with Scope 3?
Thank you for the question. One of the first interventions we have is to look at the measurement aspect. So making decisions around what methodologies to apply, what data to get. We also help companies through the data gathering and synthesis process. Lucy was talking about all the the key stakeholders that need to be involved, so helping to facilitate that where that is required. Also, it's been mentioned as well around engaging with suppliers and ways of improving that data. That is also an area of support that we help companies with. So getting suppliers to understand why the data is being asked for, to help then use that data in the most effective way possible as well. And then it goes on through to target setting, for example. And one of the key things will be around a Scope 3 target, because it is an area where the levers of control are much different to a Scope 1 and 2 emissions, where there's certainly a perception or a reality many times that there's less direct influence that a company can take. And to help make that case for change, and to do scenario analysis around how the Scope 3 could evolve in the future, and what the impact would be of taking different levers. So we kind of run through the whole gamut. I think one of the key things that, in fact, Dan mentioned really strongly in his presentation was the fact that it's a journey that collectively all companies in a value chain need to take. It's not down to just the company that's doing this exercise, and that's really important. And many times, a big hurdle, mental hurdle, that companies need to cross to say it's not just down to them. Yes, of course, they want to set a target and they feel they're importantly going to be accountable for it, but it can only be done in collaboration. So actually, collaboration and sort of whole value chain collaboration, innovation is also another area that we help companies with.
That's great, thank you. Sadly, I think our time is now up. Thank you all for joining today, and thank you to our speakers and answering those questions. It's been a really informative session. And thank you, like I say, to everyone attending. We'll shortly share a link after this with a recording, should you want to share that internally or re-watch another session. And we'll be in touch to respond, because there's quite a few questions come through. So we'll be in touch to respond to all of those, so you've all got them. So from me, thanks again to our speakers and the audience for joining, and hopefully we'll see you all at our next webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.